Politicians talk, special interests spend, our waters suffer. That's Florida's reality. The only thing standing between recovery and collapse is science. On today's episode, we sit down with Dr. Steve Davis, Chief Science Officer at the Everglades Foundation, one of the people who's been mapping out how this ecosystem actually works and what it'll take to bring it back. Steve's research in science is critical to the movement. Without his work, our fight for clean water would have no foundation, no credibility, just noise. Today, he breaks down what's really happening in the Everglades, why it's so complex, and the science-based solutions that can actually fix it. If you've ever wondered what's really behind Florida's water problems and what it's going to take to solve them, this is the episode to tune in for.
Steve, good to have you here with us today.
Great to be here.
So we met in some point early 2016, right after Captains for Clean Water was founded, and being a leader in your field as an Everglades scientist, I knew right away you had a very deep passion for the Everglades that went far beyond your job.
Yeah, well, it's a place that I was first introduced to in 1995, and since then it's just been a passion of mine, and trying to spend as much time out there as possible. It's a little harder these days, but yeah.
And what was your first introduction to the Everglades?
Well, if I go back to my childhood, it was through my grandfather's National Geographic magazines, and there were a few issues in particular that I was drawn to, the Serengeti issues and the wildlife in Africa. But I do recall a few issues about the Everglades, and to me that was like Africa in the United States, but I had no idea what it looked like. Didn't travel much as a kid outside of the state of Ohio. And so it was an opportunity to do a PhD, to do research on the Everglades in 1995 that I was drawn to. And that's the first time I stepped on an airplane, was to fly to Miami to interview for this PhD program. But
that was at FIU?
It was at FIU, working with a scientist that was a fairly recent professor hire at FIU, and he was doing Everglades research. And I'd worked with him as an undergraduate in South Carolina, in North Inlet, a coastal salt marsh there. And he invited me to come down to Miami to check it out and meet his lab and learn a little bit about the research they were doing in the Everglades, because at that time, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan didn't exist. They were just beginning to conceptualize this idea of what a restoration program would entail, and then that led to sort of visioning what a restored Everglades might look like. But that first experience in the Everglades was, for me, it was mind-blowing because it was in Florida Bay. You know, we launched from Key Largo. We took a boat out across eastern Florida Bay, went up into Taylor River, this area that was closed off to recreational use. And just to realize how far away from civilization you were there, and the colors, the smells, everything, to see crocodiles, that was just, it was crazy.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite things in nature is just any kind of transition, like going, and you see it so extreme in the Everglades. You feel like you're in the Amazon, and then in a 45-minute boat ride, you feel like you're in the Bahamas type environment. And that transition, that boat ride is just it's almost like a spiritual experience, just seeing how nature transforms so seamlessly from these, dark tannic creeks and rivers and, essentially freshwater ecosystems all the way to what you see in the Keys. It's a pretty remarkable thing, and it's not many people get to see that.
No, and you realize how vulnerable you are in those types of settings. You are out there, and I realize times are different now. We have GPS. We didn't have GPS then. We didn't have cell phone technology that could allow us to communicate with people in the Keys. We had this really heavy Motorola bag phone, but you got a mile offshore and that wasn't going to work. So you were really out there on your own, and you learned very quickly what it takes to just survive a half a day in the Everglades. It's the heat, the bugs, staying hydrated, and just trying to be as safe as possible. And that for me was a really good experience. And just for me, who I actually did a little rock climbing and some hiking when I was an undergraduate and a master's student, but being out there in this environment was just so new. And what a learning experience, even aside from the science, just to realize how incredibly beautiful, South Florida is, and places like Florida Bay and the Florida Keys.
Well, I'm curious what that initial research you were doing when you were out there. Were you taking water samples, testing out salinities, seeing where the fresh water was either held up or coming through in a big way? Like, what were you actually doing out there?
Well, the research was actually funded by the South Florida Water Management District. And some of the colleagues that I still work with today at the Water Management District were part of that project. And a few of them were graduate students like me. And so we really grew up together on Florida Bay and in a number of those mangrove creeks that connect the freshwater Everglades into eastern Florida Bay. Places like McCormick Creek, Taylor River, Joe Bay and Trout Cove area, Highway Creek, those areas that really narrow in terms of accessibility, but critically important for getting fresh water into that part of Florida Bay. And what we were tasked with looking at is understanding how restored freshwater flow would impact that part of the bay. And there are some things that go along with that, because this was in 1995, and we were just coming out of the ashes, really, of that first major seagrass die-off that started in the late 80s and then sort of simmered through the early 1990s with algal blooms, discolored water, the things that we've experienced just within the last 10 years since that 2015 die-off. And so we knew sort of the sensitivity, we knew the recovery issues in Florida Bay, and certainly we knew the importance of freshwater inflow. We also knew that this ecosystem is incredibly sensitive to nutrient loads, particularly phosphorus. And so what we were looking at in this project is how restored freshwater flow might affect nutrient loads into the bay, how it might affect ecological function from the seagrasses inland through the mangroves. And we conducted a multi-year study. Of course, we didn't have the ability to turn on flow and turn off flow, so our multi-year study, it actually turned out to be about a 6-year project, was focused on wet season, dry season dynamics and understanding how the onset of the wet season, you get a flushing of the marsh, and you do see increased loads of things like dissolved organic matter, marshes that had been previously dried out because the system we know is over-dried. When the rains hit, it's usually all at once. We get that pulse of water into the bay. So we were really tracking these dynamics at that level, beginning of the wet season, into the wet season, transition into the dry season, and how that system functioned allowed us to then understand how a restored system might work as well.
And what was just the overall conversation at that point, especially amongst the scientists? I mean, was there, like when we founded Captains for Clean Water, it was kind of this light bulb went off. It's like, wait a minute, there's 3 estuaries that are all suffering from the same problem. Was the Northern Estuary issue being talked about, or was it, very zoomed in on that specific area?
I think at that time, those were very localized issues from a general awareness perspective. Scientists knew a lot of those phenomena, those concerns had been documented. Water quality issues in, say, the Charlotte Harbor area, over in the St. Lucie, Southern Indian River Lagoon. A lot of those issues had been documented and published in peer-reviewed literature, but the average person didn't have access to that. And so it really took a community to help grow that awareness. And we're beginning to see, obviously, the fruits of that labor play out now, because people do understand. People realize that the system is still broken in terms of that flow that used to historically go south. It goes east and west, and we know the water quality issues there. But back in the 1990s, I think that was really just limited to the scientific community. And when those concepts were being developed and then ultimately leading up to the plan, it really helped to sort of bring the scientific community together to be able to talk about these things and understand this is a regional problem and we've got the ability to fix that.
Yeah, that was, the interesting thing to me is, growing up in Florida, and I was paying less attention in school than I'm assuming you did. And
Don't be so sure about that.
All I was thinking about was fishing or hunting. And, I'd been on an airplane before, but, the vast majority of my outdoor pursuits were within a couple-hour drive of my house as a kid. And it never really clicked for me that the Florida Bay issue, which, I had fished down there in probably the late 2000s, early 2010s, a decent amount, enough to really just fall in love with the place. And I heard about what happened in the late 80s. And I'm not so sure it really clicked with me. It was just like kind of background noise. A lot of the old timers were talking about that, but it was September, October 2015 that there was starting to get a lot of publicity about what happened, in 2015 with the die-off down there. I was seeing it every day on social media. I'm sure I saw videos that you guys were putting out at the time, but it wasn't until these discharges hit Fort Myers in February of 2016, a week or two into it, people are sending, hey, look what happened in Florida Bay, that all of a sudden it was like, wait a minute, this is the same problem. That water that they didn't get, that killed them, that killed their seagrass down there, that destroyed that fishery that I had the privilege of getting to learn and appreciate, that was the same water that was being artificially discharged to the Caloosahatchee River, to the St. Lucie. And, I think it was, I was almost like disappointed in myself that it took me that long, 24 years of life, to figure out that there was, essentially one holistic root cause of all of South Florida suffering.
Yeah. And those issues were absolutely connected beyond the replumbing of South Florida, because it was a drought that began developing in 2014 and then continued into 2015 that resulted in multiple consecutive months of zero fresh water flowing across Tamiami Trail. And for people today, that might sound just outrageous, but that's how the system was really designed to function, that the water conservation areas would hold on to water and only allow excess flows or available flows to go across the trail down through the park and ultimately into Florida Bay. So if we recognize that, that happened really July, August of 2015, that's when we saw Florida Bay just go belly up, because there was no water making its way through the system. And also, there wasn't a lot of cloud cover, so it was hot, a lot of evaporation off the bay. That's what really accelerates that hypersaline condition. But, with that shift from La Nina to El Nino, and then we move into late 2015, the rains hit. Everything is wet. And and then we see record rainfall in like November and December of that year. So the lake started filling up, and all of a sudden we're releasing water in mass east and west. And it was that event I recall clearly, because it was when the snowbirds were down, people that were paying top dollar to go fishing, and what the hell's wrong with the water, and what's going on here. It was typically a summertime phenomenon, but it was that very dramatic shift from a very dry condition to an incredibly record wet winter that resulted in those discharges. And as bad as that was, we're seeing the benefits of that, the political decisions that have been made since, the awareness that's been raised, having you all be part of the conversation now. It's just, it really goes back to that double whammy of seagrass die-off in Florida Bay and then those discharges in early 2016.
Yeah, it all happened so quickly, and I think that era, I still largely communicated with other fishing guides and anglers, off of social media. Like we were spending a lot less time, which is a very good thing, on social media back in 2016 than we were today. And, I remember getting calls from my buddies that were down there tarpon fishing that summer, saying how they were going up to the creeks and the Everglades from the Keys, going around Cape Sable. And I remember them saying how, but it wasn't registering what the actual implications of that were. But I remember them saying they were running their boats and just hitting these massive rafts of dead seagrass, and their boat would just stop. It would foul the prop, and they would have to take all the, and I wasn't, it was, I think even then the awareness for them that, hey, you're suffering from hypersalinity and a decades long collapse and recovery of Florida Bay is that wasn't really registering with them. It was, or with me, until a couple months had come through, and I think you guys had made a couple videos on what was happening down there, and then Stewart, Martin County, and then Pine Island Sound, Sanibel. I mean, we're here on Sanibel this morning, and this area, it was just like the perfect timing. And you had the trip advisors, the Google reviews. This was something that the tourism industry had previously decided the best strategy was just sweep it under the rug because it happens in August and September. Nobody's down here. Nobody cares about anything here. It's like our time to, get ready for season to make our livings. And by and large, the community was absent and, not wanting to bring attention to it. But, it's all of a sudden 2016, this is a January, February, March. We're experiencing water quality issues, peak tourism season, and there's wonderful restaurants and resorts that are getting 1-star reviews because there's a bunch of dead animals behind the resort on the beach, and people are upset with that. I think it was really like from the hyperconnectivity, social media change that has totally reshaped our world, like right where that was intersecting with these two crises. I think it really just made the perfect storm to allow awareness to spread very rapidly, to allow people to get educated, and seeing that stark contrast between a massive drought and a historic discharge event from excess rain in the middle of winter to spring.
Yeah, the timing of that was so critical, and both coasts really, it's like a gut punch every time those discharges occur. And when you think about what happens in Florida Bay with those seagrass die-off events, again, we have 2 of them, and if anyone knows anything about science, you need multiple samples, but we've got 2 to work with, and both of them have shown the exact same outcome, which is basically a decade to 2-decade recovery. And within that period of time, you have this constant, flaring up of algal blooms in the bay, and then they subside, and then they blow up again. And finally, after, you think of that late 80s event, by the time the seagrass was fully recovered to the pre-die-off community, it was around 2011, 2012. So basically, that bay had 3 years or so of pretty solid conditions before that die-off occurred again. And you know this, the Caloosahatchee, St. Lucie, it's the same thing, but it just gets hammered every 2 or 3 years to where it can never fully recover. And we've talked about this, where you've seen reefs that used to exist, that you used to fish, are just no longer there.
Yeah, and that's the oysters, especially in the mouth of the Caloosahatchee. I have some of my most vivid memories as a kid were snook fishing on those oyster bars, and they're completely gone now.
Yeah.
There's a live oyster here and there, but a very distant memory compared to just being there. And I remember the smells were less than pleasant. The outgoing tides in the Caloosahatchee River, but I remember them, like these vivid smells and the sounds of all the oysters crackling on the end of the outgoing tide, and all those oyster bars used to just be covered in schools of mullet. There were mullet all over the place in there, and the snook would chase them. You would see mullet like jumping up on the oyster bars sometimes because there were so many snook just surrounding them and just going there and gorging on those mullet, and those. I've got a 3 and a 4 year old boy. They will not see that. Those oyster bars. I mean, you can go back on Google Earth and see the Shell Point, all the oyster bars in the mouth of the Caloosahatchee. They're gone. You can watch the discharge events. It was really, I think, started around 04, 05 where they really started taking a beating, and then they were kind of barely hanging on. 2013 just annihilated everything that was left. And then they got hit in 2016 and then 2017 and then 2018. And, I don't know. I mean, my uncle that took me out on the boat a lot as a kid, and some of the old timers that I used to hang out with, I mean, they would say those oyster bars have been there for hundreds of years. That's how long it takes to, really get an oyster head that comes up out of the water on the low tide. Sad to see stuff like that just disappear.
It is, and it makes you wonder what, of course, you read accounts of areas even further south around Biscayne Bay, into Florida Bay, and what those systems looked like, and the turtle populations that they supported, because the grass was so abundant and so lush that you support manatees and turtles and everything else that's associated with those communities, including oysters. There were oysters all around South Florida, and you don't really see oysters anymore. Some of the creeks along the southwest coast, you'll run into them, but it's not what it used to be. And of course, we're all sort of introduced to this ecosystem at different points in life, and so our baseline is really skewed by that. And it's so important to understand the history. It's important to learn from the old timers, because they saw the system prior to you, and they have that critical reference point. It reminds me of one of my colleagues and co-authors, Tom Lodge. He was a PhD student at University of Miami in the early 70s, and his first exposure to Lake Okeechobee was in the late 60s. And the lake's water quality, from the data we have, really didn't start to decline until the early 70s. And so his introduction to it is critical reference point. And he described multiple locations across the pelagic part of the lake where you could see sandy bottom.
Wow.
Not just see sand, but that you could see through the water column to the bottom.
Wow.
It's shocking for me. And it's, again, just one of those reference points to, describe what part of the system, a critical part of the system, used to look like. And those of us that have been out there now, you're not going to see bottom.
Yeah, and I've read some of these. There's a couple books that were written by old timers that were here in Pine Island Sound, and they talk about how there were so many oyster bars that it made it almost impossible to navigate Pine Island Sound. And I think earlier on in my life, I had written that off as just, crazy old timer talk, but it probably wasn't. That was, and now, I mean, you could drive around blindfolded in Pine Island Sound for a year and not hit an oyster bar. I mean, we definitely have some, but they're few and far between, and they're in places that get a lot of, tidal flushing, but just enough fresh water to really, maintain those oysters there. And, reading back those, through those books, and some of my clients had shared some of them with me, and just, we used to have schools on some of the islands here in Pine Island Sound. Punta Blanca Island had a school on it, and I remember reading through that and just thinking, about the stories in there about how the kids would go back to the island that they lived on and fish along the way, and just definitely was a lot more productive estuary back then before we screwed it up.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the substrate in many of our coastal waters and places like Lake Okeechobee have changed to the point where you've got a layer of really viscous muck on the bottoms of these areas. So if you think about restoring oysters in some of these areas, it's not just solving the water quality issue. In some areas, it's also about the substrate as an impediment. You can't get oysters to reform in some of these really viscous, nasty, mucky bottoms.
Yeah, no, and I think where I see that most extreme example of that today is the South Fork of the St. Lucie River. We were out on the boat with Major Bell from the Army Corps with Captain Mike Holliday a couple months ago, and Mike brought a handle from a boat brush, and it's like 4 feet of that muck.
Yeah.
4 feet of it. And, Mike's telling stories about how he used to, go in there and cast net bait in some of these areas that kind of the softer curves in the river there where there's, a little bit of a bay, and, just areas where not a lot of flow. So all that muck just kind of accumulated in there, but used to be hard sand bottom, and there's, 4 feet of that muck in there. And that's, pretty hard to believe, but I mean, we see it over here on the West Coast for sure. I mean, all the downtown Fort Myers area and the Caloosahatchee, all the way down to the mouth of the river, you see the same stuff. If you drop an anchor or put your power pole down on your boat, you pull it up, and it's just dripping with this black sludge.
Yeah.
Real quick, Steve, we've been describing some of the impacts of this disjointed system as a whole. And we know from our data looking, we have a ton of people that listen to this that they're not even from Florida. They live kind of all over. So they might not be kind of familiar with what the initial problem was in the first place. So I think if you could, high level explain, what is the overall problem, and then kind of paint the picture. I know you talked about that 2015 die-off. Basically, paint the picture of what that really looked like, the scale of it. But maybe first, just super high level, what the Everglades system used to function like, and how it has in the past, 20, 30 years been functioning, and what the goal of it all is moving forward.
Well, I think to understand the problem, even if you're not from South Florida, you need to consider the scale and the landscape. And people generally know that Florida's flat. It's sloped from north to south. So water generally flows from north to south, especially in the historic system. And so you also have to consider that we get 4 to 5 feet of rainfall every year. I've got colleagues in Phoenix that just got 1.5 inches over the past week, and they called it a historic event.
Wow.
And they get about 6 to 8 inches of rain every year. We're routinely getting that in a single event. Mm-hmm. So we get an incredible amount of rainfall, and most of that comes within our wet season, which coincides with the hurricane season. So that much water across an area of about 18,000 square miles doesn't flow very fast. There's not a slope, and it's not a highly erosive landscape. So water generally spreads out across the landscape. And we do benefit from having very porous, transmissive soils and geology. So water will infiltrate into the ground. That's obviously critical for our water supply in many areas of
Drinking
South
water
Florida.
supply.
Yeah. So the system is about 200 plus miles long from south of Orlando all the way down to the tip of the peninsula into Florida Bay, which is the ultimate receiver of water. When we think of estuaries, that is the Everglades estuary because it receives the fresh water from that river of grass ecosystem. That water coming from the north would ultimately reach Lake Okeechobee. Lake Okeechobee is vast in terms of area. It's relatively shallow in terms of depth. And it's not to belittle the lake, but it's like a giant puddle. And when the lake would receive those flows from that wet season and from the previous months, making its way down that stretch, 100 plus miles all the way up to Orlando, the lake would spill to the south. And there, it was super flat. It would fan out 40 miles wide and flow very slowly. And when it was ripping, we're talking about an inch or so per second. So gradually working its way down another 100 miles at a slope of about 1.5 to 2 inches for every mile that you go south. And all that to put into perspective that this was a river of grass. That very slow flow allowed emergent vegetation to establish. Habitats were created by the meandering river of grass. We had ridges of sawgrass offset by sloughs and teardrop-shaped tree islands that were all oriented in the direction of that flow. And that water would ultimately reach its final destination down into Florida Bay. But when it was super wet, water would spill through the Atlantic coastal ridge into the lower East Coast waters like Biscayne Bay. And so the system was vast, it was connected, it was rainfall driven, so the quality was just superb. And it was incredibly productive, despite the fact that it was a very low nutrient environment. And it was because of that seasonal hydrology, the habitats that allowed for fish to grow up, small fish now, to grow up across that entire landscape. But during the dry season, all that small prey biomass would concentrate in the deeper parts of the system, generally the sloughs. And it was that sort of seasonal concentration that would allow for the massive wading bird populations and alligators and just top predators that the system was associated with. And of course, we changed that when we started trying to route water away from Lake Okeechobee. We tried to drain wetlands, ultimately converting them into farmland. And so it really was a pretty dramatic series of cuts that resulted in the disconnected, compartmentalized, reduced Everglades ecosystem that we're now working to restore.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I think, you know, when people are picturing this in their mind, this slow trickle, that would, you know, it would be consistent. You know, the dry season wasn't too dry and the wet season wasn't too wet because it had that time to fan out, like you said. And then kind of when they started ditching and draining, what did it look like after that? And I guess to this point, like what started to change? Did the dry seasons get drier in certain areas? What kind of changed and shifted around?
Well, it depends on your perspective. And so obviously communities that were growing up around the coast and dependent upon the resources that the coastal waters would provide, of course, they're beginning to see changes because there's less water that's sort of making its way into those near coast areas, or the quality of the water changed, or the volumes and timing of that water changed. And so they're seeing impacts at the coastal zone, but within the Everglades, it was really, you know, a boom or bust situation because of the way it was compartmentalized and the way water was managed off of agricultural lands and en masse, you know, dumped into these compartments. And so water levels would rise very quickly. The ecosystem would also dry out in the dry season. I mentioned that most of our rain comes in the wet season. Our dry season is really dry for the most part. And so the system was dependent on the rain that it received, not only in that wet season, but potentially the previous wet season because of how long and connected the system was. Right now, it's really a boom or bust situation where we're trying to move water off of ag lands and we fill up these water conservation areas, or they're really left to their own devices during the dry season. They dry out, and what we were observing, of course, is just increased fire, wildfires spreading across the Everglades. It's a natural disturbance in the ecosystem. It's a fire-dependent system in some ways, but we started to, we started to document more serious and severe fires across the system that were really changing habitats relative to what they were previously.
Yeah, and so, you know, we would like you described, we basically, you know, some of these areas were relying on the wet season to basically survive and keep going to the next year. And then that brings us to 2015 that we were talking about earlier, when there was a drought, and suddenly that area that was dry, it did not quite get the rain necessary to survive. And then what was the fallout of that event?
So which event was?
The 2015.
Yes, it really, it was something we saw developing over time. And the situation with Florida Bay is that it has a very long memory. Like some of us, we just don't forget things. Some things we do, but Florida Bay, with respect to water and salinity conditions, it's got a long memory. And it's because water sits in the bay. It doesn't exchange well with the tides. The Keys are a bit of an impediment, especially the upper Keys. And so you also factor in the fact that the bay is kind of a series of basins, like an ice cube tray, and it's only the outermost basins that are tidally flushed. Once you get sort of, you know, if you know Florida Bay, the Crocodile Dragover area, once you get east of that, that water will sit in the bay upwards for a year. And unless it's nourished with new fresh water coming in from the Everglades, it'll sit there. And it doesn't just sit there, it actually evaporates out. And so salts begin to accumulate as a result of that. And because the drought began in 2014, we didn't have a super wet 2014 wet season. That carries us over into early 2015. That memory, again, goes back to that 2014 drought. And so the salinities were already high entering what would have been the start of that wet season in 2015, which our wet season generally begins around mid-May. It didn't start then. It didn't start in June. We started to get a little bit of rain in July, but by that point, we started to see an acceleration of that hypersalinity curve. Once we see salinities in Florida Bay approach about 40 to 45 parts per thousand, and ocean water is around 35 for perspective, it's really an acceleration until we get rainfall or more water coming in from the Everglades. And so when you think about it from that perspective, one way that I talk about Everglades restoration in terms of its benefits to Florida Bay is it helps to build that kind of drought resilience, because we're able to capture water that we would otherwise be dumping, and we're able to clean it and flow it south, ultimately to the park and Florida Bay where we know it's needed.
And so the Florida Bay wasn't getting any fresh water and also wasn't getting any rainwater. And I like that comparison of an ice tray. So that water was just sitting there and evaporating and getting super salty. And then what happens with the grass just starts to uproot, and then how big was that mass? Because from what I know, it was pretty substantial.
Yeah, and the grass doesn't die from hypersalinity. It really dies because it's asphyxiated. And so plants, just like us, we need oxygen in order to survive. And plants have the advantage over us in that they can produce oxygen. They photosynthesize, and they produce it in such abundance that if you ever snorkel on healthy seagrass beds, during midday, you'll see these little champagne bubbles, adhering to the blades, and then there'll be so much of it, it just sort of bubbles in a stream up to the surface. It's really just one of the little things that I love about these ecosystems in South Florida. But they produce so much oxygen that it diffuses down into their roots, and their roots are where the bulk of the living biomass is in seagrasses. We just see the green blades, which are the habitat to lots of the things that we enjoy. But there's a lot of biomass below ground that needs to be kept alive, and the way it's kept alive is from that surplus oxygen. It diffuses down into the roots and creates almost like a force field around the roots, because it's a really harsh environment that these grasses are growing in. The carbonate muds in Florida Bay are super dense. They're anoxic. They have an accumulation of hydrogen sulfide, that rotten egg smell that we associate with a lot of our coastal ecosystems here. That's toxic. And if that force field that the plants have is diminished, that sulfide will get into the roots instantly. The plants will die. They'll shed their leaves, and you'll see all these green leaves floating across the bay. And that's what we saw in that 2015 event. It occurred overnight, and we suspect that it was just before the sun rose that this occurred, because those grasses overnight, and so when they're stressed, when seagrasses are stressed, they lower their photosynthetic productivity, which means they're not producing as much oxygen as they would otherwise. And when you add in, and I'm going down a rabbit hole here, I realize.
No, I love it.
It's also hot summer days when these die-offs occur. And hot water, many people know, holds less oxygen than cold water. Hot, salty water holds even less oxygen. So they're in a stressed environment. It's overnight. They're not photosynthesizing. They're not producing oxygen. And there's almost no oxygen in the water. So nighttime is the worst time for seagrasses in a stressed condition. And that's what happened. Many guides reported seeing these racks of just dead seagrass leaves covering tens of thousands of acres of central and western Florida Bay. And of course, we know the outcome, but it's not from the hypersalinity, but the hypersalinity begins a cascade of events that ultimately leads to them dying back.
Yeah. I want to go back to where we were talking about like the manipulated system. When the Everglades was drained, and you I think perfectly described the kind of Everglades that God created before we came in and screwed it up. But, I want to go back to that disconnect between Lake Okeechobee and the Everglades. And I think a lot of people have a hard time realizing you've got the Everglades agricultural area immediately south of Lake Okeechobee. That used to be a river of grass, like where there's, vast sugarcane fields today. That used to be that river of grass, and the lake there was it was just naturally overflowed through the glades. Can you explain the kind of the impacts of keeping what used to be 500,000 acres of swamp, keeping that dry? What impacts does that have, and how is that connected to Florida Bay?
There are a number of challenges just from a water management perspective there, because that area, as you mentioned, historically was Everglades. And it was also an area where we had some of the deepest peat deposits on top of that limestone bedrock that we know exists across South Florida. And that was also critical for providing that slope. from north to south. And so it's estimated that the peat soil depths were 15, 20 feet at the southern rim of Lake Okeechobee, and then tapered south until you got into what are today the water conservation areas. And so draining water away from that part of the system, and to this day, keeping it relatively dry, conducive for agriculture, has resulted in a pretty dramatic loss of that muck soil to the present day, where the estimates are about 6.5 feet of soil elevation across that entire area has been lost.
Oh, wow. So almost half. You said it was around 12, and now it's about 6 in that area?
Well, it was shallower as you would move south, but the average across that area is about 6.5 feet. And that's, there are multiple peer-reviewed publications that point to that. And without even getting into the carbon emission issues associated with that, just that elevation loss alone has created a basin that to this day, water managers are still, tasked with maintaining water levels that are optimal for agriculture in the canals, but yet we're still trying to flow water south through this basin to get that water into ultimately storage, but also into stormwater treatment areas to cleanse the water so that we can get it south. And we've actually got to pump that water. It won't flow on its own anymore. So it's an altered system from that perspective, but it's also just simply a divide now. We can't send or move the quantities that moved historically to the south. That's why we need restoration infrastructure. That's why we need storage, because, and I referred to the EA reservoir as the heart bypass surgery of the Everglades. Lake Okeechobee, you'll hear this many times, and I'm sure you've heard it a lot. It was the beating heart of the Everglades, right? That was how water, aside from the rainfall that the Everglades to the south would receive, it would also receive water from that beating heart each and every year. And so this reservoir is critical because it's the heart bypass. It's what allows us to get water from the lake into storage, ultimately into those treatment wetlands, and then we can flow it south where we know it's desperately needed.
And yeah, it's crazy to think about, though. I mean, you literally have a 6.5 foot deep bowl in what used to be a river, and the implications of rainy season, all that, 4 to 5 feet of rainfall has to go somewhere. And that goes to the Everglades. It used to, I think, historically get back pumped into Lake Okeechobee, but now it goes into the water conservation areas, and it's pretty bizarre to think about. Like the Caloosahatchee here, if we were to just have a stretch of the river that we decided we were going to keep dry all the time, it's going to have massive negative impacts on the surrounding communities to do that.
Yes, and that part of the system, you think about maybe 700,000 acres that the Everglades agricultural area comprises. Imagine just deep peat soils and dense, productive sawgrass. That part of the system was also storage. The way we talk about storage, like having a reservoir, the way Lake Okeechobee in some sense stores water, that part of the system was critical storage as well, because of the thickness of the soil, because of the slope of the landscape. It would, even during dry periods, continue to bleed water southward throughout the ridge and slough, and ultimately down to what is now Everglades National Park. So, from that perspective, we also lost a significant storage and water quality enhancement component of the system.
And you explained the heart that is Lake Okeechobee, and then to me it kind of sounds like the EA reservoir is almost like an artificial artery to continue the process of pumping, the water into the Everglades. So high level speaking, the goal of Everglades restoration is basically to mimic the already perfect design that was in place. And I kind of wanted to talk about, maybe how is restoration going? Because, we get that a lot, and I think people don't understand, some do, that it's a really long process. It took us however many years to get into this situation. It's not like this is going to be an overnight solution, but maybe talk about what are we seeing today as far as are we making good progress? Is it, substantial? What are we seeing today in 2025 here?
Well, what you're going to hear today is very different from what it would have been 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when these issues were blowing up in Florida Bay and East and West Coast, because now we've got infrastructure in the ground. We've got critical projects that are near complete, ready for operational testing, C-43, C-44, good examples of that. And then the most critical project, that heart bypass surgery for the Everglades, the EA reservoir, under construction. Not only that, but accelerated to the point where we could actually see this project complete by the end of this decade. I never would have imagined this 10, 15 years ago. And I've been, working on this at the Everglades Foundation for 16 years now, 10 years or so prior to that as a professor at Texas A&M University, but still doing Everglades research. And then as a graduate student working on this issue, I just never imagined that we would see this acceleration in such a short period of time. And we are seeing on the ground benefits in different parts of the system. Projects like Picayune Strand that got out of the box early, a very large, complicated project covering 55,000 acres. We're seeing improvements in that part of the system. That's enormous in its scale and also the impacts that it will deliver to the coast, the benefits. Tamiami Trail bridges, and combined with a lot of the other infrastructure along Tamiami Trail, like the S333 North, like the seepage barriers along that northeastern boundary of Everglades National Park, all of that working together to dramatically increase flow of water into the park and especially into Northeast Shark River Slough. Again, we're even seeing potential. We don't have this completely nailed down, but we're seeing indication that that flow is also building resilience in Florida Bay and improving upon that hypersalinity condition that we know to occur. We just had a drought this past year, and we didn't see any indication of Florida Bay going belly up, and a lot of it was related to the flows that we've been able to increase into the park as a result of that infrastructure. If we go north of Lake Okeechobee, the Kissimmee River restoration, it's just a little mind-boggling to think about each of these projects as standalones. Anywhere else in the country, these would be heralded as incredible achievements in environmental restoration, and these are just individual components of this much larger program that we're trying to move forward. And benefits in the Kissimmee, we're making progress in nutrient reduction coming into the Everglades from that agricultural area with the stormwater treatment areas and the load reductions. We're not just seeing it come out of the stormwater treatment areas, but we're seeing evidence of that load reduction now in the water conservation areas. So all of these things are pointing in the direction of just dramatic progress. And I'm really optimistic what the next decade looks like. And, the next decade will conclude with my retirement. So I'm really heartened to know that we're on the cusp of really achieving restoration success.
That's awesome. And, before we started recording, something that was super interesting to me, Daniel, you said you were at a speaking engagement and you had some people, asking, oh, where's the science on this all? Like, how's the science going? And Steve, why don't you kind of say what you kind of said to that?
Well, and it's not to brag or anything, but the science has worked out for the most part. There are always things that we're trying to address, especially related to climate change and sea level rise and impacts from invasive species that are, proliferating across much of the system. There's still a lot to learn. But in terms of the water quantity, quality type issues, we know what the answer is. And we know that this infrastructure works. I just cited some examples of success that we're seeing. And it's really a reflection that our aquatic ecosystems are incredibly resilient. If we can just clean the water and we can, somewhat mimic the quantities of the historic system, we know that the Everglades will benefit. So all that to say, the science has worked out. It's really ensuring the political will and that process to get this across the goal line. And I joke with colleagues sometimes, that science just gets you into the red zone. If you're a football fan, it just gets you into the red zone. You really need politics, you need strong leadership, political will to get you across the goal line. And we are seeing evidence of that with the increased funding, with prioritization of projects like the EA Reservoir and acceleration of that. But the science has worked out. We know that we're headed in the right direction.
Yeah, it's so encouraging to see. I mean, being out there at the EAA reservoir for so many, components of that, the ribbon cuttings and the groundbreakings, all that. It's so exciting. And, the C-43 recently here in the Caloosahatchee that opened up. It's awesome to see all these projects. It's definitely sad that we let things go to shit as far as our waters go, to the point where you had to have fishing guides and outdoor brands and hotels and resorts and chambers of commerce really take that responsibility, personal responsibility to demand change. I do think that's sad. I sit here and wonder, it's like we just want to live our lives, and we want to, not have to deal with fixing problems that never should have been created. And we're a day late and a dollar short on a lot of it, but it is incredible when you actually go out there and see that even though things have gotten really bad as far as the quality of our water, the health of our fisheries, at times, it seemed apocalyptic. If you were to drive around in the boat here in 2018 and just see miles long rafts of 15, 20-year-old snook and tarpon and redfish that were, floating just dead everything everywhere. It's sad that it had to get to that point, but the resiliency of the system, especially down there in Florida Bay, where we probably avoided a catastrophe again last summer. It is encouraging. It's sad, but it's encouraging.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it takes events like those we've been talking about to get people's attention, to make them pissed off. My wife and I walk in Miami a lot, and we walk across Biscayne Bay, some of the bridges, and every morning I'm picking up trash, bottles and plastic bags and things that people leave behind. It's just who I am, but that kind of thing makes me angry. And so it gets me to take action. And you just want more people to be aware that there's actually a problem. If it doesn't affect their bottom line, then generally people don't connect to these kinds of issues. I think it really is getting people more connected to their community, connected to the resources that their community depends on. Mm-hmm. Miami depends on a healthy Biscayne Bay. And, we've got some challenges there. And it goes beyond the Everglades. But all that to say, it really is heartening to see what a pissed off coalition of business owners can do to move this issue forward. We just need to get more people engaged and aware of these issues that maybe aren't as connected.
Yeah. Have you ever tried explaining this issue to like a toddler?
No, but
yeah,
I'm curious to hear this.
Well, it reframes your perspective.
Yeah.
Our favorite book in our house is the Lorax. We read the Lorax all the time. And, my little boys, they see me go to work and they know what Captains for Clean Water is. But when you really sit down there and say, well, the water had to get this bad in order for us to do something about it. And then you look at them and, the damages that were done here and, up until the 2018, which is the last major crisis we had, you can still take them out there and show them a very impaired ecosystem. And if you look at your formative years as a kid, they're deprived of a lot of stuff that I was deprived of a lot of stuff that previous generations were. And it's a really weird thing to try to tell a kid that like it's like, yeah, our roof was leaking in our house and we let it leak for 2 years before we decided to, fix this, massive mold pit that, it's like, no, as soon as you see a drop, you're going to get that fixed to the best of your ability. And it's a weird thing to try to describe to a kid that we let it get this bad before struggling to get the progress that we've had to date. And it doesn't make any sense to them. They're like, well, why wouldn't you have done that before the mess got that bad? And I'm like, you're right. Like, that's a damn good question. I don't have an answer other than we're idiots and you guys make total sense of this.
Yeah.
Like, they're just so confused. Like, why would you, I show them pictures of, the red tide, the blue-green algae blooms, and they're like, why wouldn't you guys stop this? And, it's like, I don't know. It pisses me off that I don't have an answer to that question.
Yeah, and I think it might be a generational thing too, and certain kids that grow up in families that maybe spend more time outdoors. As a kid, I didn't spend a whole lot of time outdoors. Mine was mostly playing sports. That was my outdoor time, and I think it's getting people to realize that these resources that we're seeing declining over time, we're responsible for them. Mm-hmm. And, I talk to people in Miami that Biscayne Bay might be our front yard, but the Everglades is our backyard. And we're all responsible for these ecosystems. And it's important to, you mentioned using the house as sort of your example with your son. We depend on these ecosystems, and we're learning more that our economy is directly tied to the health of the Everglades in ways that people did not understand. Yes, people, can relate to fishing and boating and tying that to water quality, maybe real estate values, but there's so much more to it than just that. And some of the economic studies that we have engaged in and led over the last few years really point to the fact that the roof is leaking. We need to spend the money now to fix it because it's in our best interest. This asset that we have in South Florida is a $1 trillion asset, and we can't squander that.
Yeah, that was pretty unbelievable when you guys released that study. What does that mean? Everglades is a $1 trillion asset. What does that mean to me?
It means that on an annual basis, conservatively, this ecosystem is contributing about $35 billion to our state's economy in areas like real estate values, in recreation, again, the more traditional things that we associate with it, but also things like carbon sequestration, storm surge, and flood attenuation, all of these things that we don't think about unless our homes do flood. And a good example of that might be Hurricane Irma in 2017, which, we had the die-off, then we had the discharges, and then the next year we had Irma hit South Florida. Well, much of Irma's strength was sapped by that expansive mangrove forest along the Florida southwest coast. And obviously, it can't do that to every storm. It depends on the track and the intensity and those kinds of factors. But we know that this ecosystem also values and is valuable in terms of helping to protect our communities. So on an annual basis, that's what it's contributing to our economy. And it's important to use that as a reference point because Everglades restoration in total is about $25 billion. That's our most recent estimate. And so if this system is kicking in more than $30 billion annually, thinking of your house as an example, yeah, roof repair is expensive, but relative to the entire asset, it's nothing and it's critical. But the $1 trillion comes from the fact that this is a 50-year program in terms of the infrastructure and how it's planned out. And it's generally a generation, as a reference point. And over that time span, that adds up to $1 trillion asset, and it's important that we value it as such.
Well, yeah, those are impressive numbers. So your role today, you're the Chief Science Officer at the Everglades Foundation. Is that right?
Yes.
What's exciting in the world of Everglades science? I know that the economic stuff that y'all are working on is crucial. It really helps people understand how to not be an idiot and fix something that really needs to be fixed. What else are you guys working on?
Well, we're working on a variety of things at any point in time, and including just tracking the health and benefits that these projects are providing the ecosystem. But for a number of years now, we've also been working on sort of direct experimental type science in the Everglades, and we've got 2 projects. One has been a relatively long-term project that helps us to understand how some of our coastal wetlands may be vulnerable to sea level rise and saltwater intrusion, especially with reduced freshwater head coming in from the top. And so for a number of years now, we've been developing this body of science to the point where now the Army Corps of Engineers has incorporated this as a performance measure into their restoration planning for the Biscayne Bay Southeast Everglades project, where they're looking at wetland resilience and how increasing freshwater flow and potentially adding a little bit of elevation to those wetlands can build resilience in the face of sea level rise. Another project that we're working on is in collaboration with Florida International University, where this is led by Dr. Evelyn Geiser at FIU, and she's been leading a study to understand what the phosphorus threshold is in Big Cypress National Preserve. This is sort of the focal point of the Western Everglades Restoration Project, and surprisingly, we don't have a science-based phosphorus standard for that part of the system. We do for the River of Grass Everglades, and people may have heard about the 10 part per billion phosphorus threshold that we're aiming to achieve with these treatment wetlands. We don't have that standard for Big Cypress. We can go on the assumption that it's the same, but we know that the soils and the plant communities are very different over there than they are further east. So we're working with Dr. Geiser as well as scientists at the National Park Service, the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians, and the South Florida Water Management District to establish that threshold. So as that project is being built out and the water treatment component is being planned, that it's being designed to meet that standard rather than just aiming in the dark. So again, this is where new science will help to guide the way and ensure that we're, spending hundreds of millions of dollars on Big Cypress restoration and delivering the benefits that we all expect.
Yeah, and something else that's been interesting to me in the science space that I want to dive into a little more was you guys recently, I think it was with Dave Tomasco that you partnered on the red tide modeling. That was, explain what that is, what that does.
Well, so this work, and credit to Dr. Miles Medina, who led much of that work. He was a graduate student at University of Florida, and he's gone on now to do science as a consultant. And he helped to establish a more definitive connection between lake discharge and red tide around the Charlotte Harbor area. Not red tide in the Gulf of Mexico, but red tide in the Charlotte Harbor area. And that's a complicated methodology because discharges are obviously freshwater, but they're delivering pollutants that marine algae can benefit from. And so at that nexus where freshwater meets marine and estuarine water from the Gulf of Mexico, that's where that interface of red tide penetration occurs. And so this modeling effort, and he's refined it over time to the point where now we have a predictive tool that still needs further refinement, but it's a predictive tool that allows us to connect discharges with conditions we know exist in Charlotte Harbor and also conditions further offshore that we know help to fuel and potentially exacerbate red tide. And so it's now being sort of tested on the streets, if you will, and we're learning from it. And the point of these models isn't to say that we have all the answers. It's just to say that we're growing our understanding of the connection of these different factors. And one of the things we know is that, red tide does form further out on the shelf. It's driven by upwelling from the depths of the Gulf. But as those red tide events are pushed further into our coastal zone, they don't discriminate as to the nutrient source. They'll take anything they can get. If it's fertilizers running off our landscapes, or if it's like a fire hose of phosphorus and nitrogen from Lake Okeechobee, they're going to take advantage of it. If those nutrient sources don't exist, then the red tide events will snuff themselves out. But if there's further fuel available, they will take advantage of it. And so conceptually, that's what this predictive tool helps us with, within proximity to Charlotte Harbor, making the connection with the Caloosahatchee discharge.
Yeah, and I mean that's a very intelligent and scientific way of articulating that. I'll tell you my experience. If you go ask anybody that's fished Pine Island Sound for 15, 20 years, as soon as those discharges come, that is the first thing out of everyone's mouth at the boat ramps is, oh, great, now we got to deal with the red tide. Mm-hmm. And it was shocking to me growing up, hearing that all the time and observing it. I mean, the discharges would start, the red tide would come in, and it would get bad. If we got red tide and there was no discharges, you knew it was going to be gone in a couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. Rule of thumb. I mean, it's have there been, scenarios that didn't fall perfectly into that? Maybe. I don't know. But generally, when there's discharges and red tides present, buckle up. It's going to get really bad. When there's red tide present, no discharges, even if the red tide is really bad when it first shows up, a week or two, it's gone. And it was so surprising to me when we started the organization, we're communicating that, the science community was like, well, be careful when you say that because there's no definitive science that's proving that there's a connection here. And I'm like, I don't need a scientist to tell me that. The same way I don't need a veterinarian to tell me that the raccoon that's flattened on the side of the road is dead. I mean, it's a pancake. Of course it's dead. This red tide, same deal. I mean, you see it literally on the tide lines where the discharges are meeting that Gulf water, schools of bait fish colliding in that, where that super bloom is starting. I mean, I grew up seeing it, and I think in the absence of special interest, misinformation, PR, propaganda, common sense and science can work really well together. And we could have had an open discussion on this, but unfortunately, I think a lot of that special interest influence on the PR and kind of propaganda side of it, we're taking advantage that there wasn't a study saying this is, because it's a hard thing to figure out. Like, I mean, you had to get into like the nitrogen isotope tracking from all the different basins and a ridiculous amount of shit that you never should have had to prove, that we had to prove just to show something that I mean, looking at charts and graphs, I mean, red tide can show up anywhere, but I mean, we're here on Sanibel Island today. We can deal with a week or two of red tide. We cannot deal with a mega 2018 level super bloom that was absolutely made worse by those discharges, that you can see concentrations of the Cornea brevis so thick that it was like Purell hand sanitizer. It was a gel washing up onto the beach. Yeah. And it really was, I think, the wake up call for me is just the amount of resistance that we got when we were founding this organization, saying these red tide blooms are absolutely made. It's common sense on the docks. It's common sense to the fishing guides. I mean, when you're out there 300 plus days a year on the water and you observe this, every time there's a major discharge event and red tide present, it gets horrendously bad. Yeah, I guess if you're not out on the water and I mean, I've got asthma, so I'm having to, rip through, a couple inhalers a week trying to just survive out there. It blew my mind how so many, folks on the policy side, the science side were scared of something that to me it's just like, guys, this is real obvious. And having that science now, because we were chastised, we were attacked, we were told that we're spreading misinformation for saying this, and it's like, okay, all the science comes out, and it's like, who was lying, and why? And why were they lying? It's very obvious that that there is a connection there, and now having that science, it's I think it gets back to the discussion about you're talking to a toddler, talking to your own kids about this, and we got to be careful about and I get it, we want to be precise and accurate as we can with science, but I feel that we've deprived a lot of kids of a lot from not being able to look at this and be like, okay, we got a problem here. These red tides are getting way out of control. We know the intensity and duration of them have significantly increased, and we know they feed on nutrients. It was a little shocking to me that it took science so long to just come back and say, okay, yeah, no, there's a link there.
Well, and part of it was data availability, and another part was really just the technology. And one of the approaches that Miles has taken is more of a machine learning type modeling approach, which is really, it's no longer in its infancy, we'll say. So it's fairly recent. And as we increase our number of observations, through science and monitoring, and these tools advance to help us make connections across these multiple, rather complicated variables, we're able to see things more clearly. But it gets back to the scientific process. It's a continual process of refinement and advancement. It's never something where we just sort of pat ourselves on the back and say we're done, because it's a continual process of trying to identify uncertainty and minimize that as much as possible to strengthen your signal relative to the noise.
Would the ultimate goal, and if you know this, and maybe Miles could potentially answer it better, but would the ultimate goal with this model would be to have as a tool for the Army Corps, so they can the model can show, hey, the conditions are not good for discharges, and let's be honest, we're still going to get these discharges. We're not to the point where we're not going to see them. So it's going to happen, but is the goal for this model to be a tool where we could show the Army Corps of the current conditions and maybe they think twice of discharging at that time? Is that the goal of it?
That was our goal going
Gotcha.
in, was to be able to inform management as to how to reduce risk as much as possible. That's the ultimate utility of this type of tool as it becomes sort of refined over time. And the Corps has demonstrated a willingness to operate Lake Okeechobee within this new flexibility that we have in the LOSUM plan. And so we do think that there's potential to reduce risk as we learn more through the modeling and model refinement, and then of course providing that information to managers.
Gotcha. Oh, I had another question. You mentioned the study with Big Cypress and getting that phosphorus threshold into place. And I think I asked Daniel, the other day, it's required that the Everglades reaches the threshold so it doesn't get too much phosphorus in the Everglades. But I've talked to Mike Holliday about this too. It's but why isn't there no threshold for the East and West Coast? That's just fair game, can release all you want. Is there anything being done where, just like Big Cypress, they're trying to work on that? Do you know of anything for the Clusacchie and the St. Lucie where they have to reach a threshold as well?
Well, we have numeric nutrient criteria for many of our coastal waters, and those are kind of recommendations of do not exceed unless, there's nothing you can do. And in the case of Lake Okeechobee, because the releases are made for flood protection and risk reduction around the lake, then that kind of supersedes something like a nutrient criterion. With the Everglades, it's a legally mandated threshold for protecting that ecosystem. So it came about through litigation. And so those stormwater treatment areas were sized and are managed to meet that legally mandated limit for the system. So it two very different kinds of ways of looking at it. Ideally, we would have, measures in place to minimize or avoid that risk altogether. But we have a situation where many of our waterways are polluted. Lake Okeechobee, a good example. When those releases are made, we know that pollution will be coming downstream to these communities. And there's really nothing to do about it at this point until we solve the Lake Okeechobee problem, until we build the infrastructure for Everglades restoration. We know sending more water south means that we're not sending it here. And sending it south means we have to clean it. So there's kind of the win-win situation of Everglades restoration, but there's much more to do north of the lake. We're not achieving what's called the total maximum daily load for Lake Okeechobee, which is kind of an annual do not exceed for phosphorus. You read the back of the Advil bottle before you take one, and I think the limit might be 4. If you take more than that, you're going to damage your liver. Well, for Lake Okeechobee, it's 140 metric tons of phosphorus per year, and 35 of that is assumed to come from the atmosphere. So really, it's 105 coming from the watershed, and regularly, we are 3 times or more that amount. So the lake's liver is hurting.
Yeah.
And until we solve that issue, we're still going to have a polluted lake, and when the releases are made, that's what's going east and west. And then you also know that there are local basin contributions that need to be dealt with. But when the lake is releasing, that's far and away the largest source to this coast and the East Coast as well.
Does that kind of impact as far as, being able to send as much water south as possible? Is that threshold? It wouldn't be an issue because we want it to be clean. But does that, since we want to send so much water south per year, is reaching that threshold a difficult task because of the infrastructure in place? Like, do we need more STAs to be able to filter more of that phosphorus out? Is that a solution to that?
Well, that's a great question. It depends on your target. The comprehensive plan was not designed to eliminate discharge. There's just not enough storage built into it. And there's a lot of storage in SERP that, as of yet, we don't have a viable path for in terms of like aquifer storage and recovery, storing water below ground, storing water in-ground areas, lime rock pits along the eastern boundary of the water conservation areas in Everglades National Park. We don't have a solution for that yet because we can't contain that water sufficiently to call it storage. It's plugged into the local aquifer system. So all that to say, we're not meeting all the storage goals of SERP, but we know we need storage. We need above ground storage in terms of the EA reservoir, the reservoirs east and west, and then the Lake Okeechobee Component A reservoir north of the lake when it undergoes construction. But that, again, does not eliminate the discharge. So if the question is, how do we eliminate discharge or approach it more than what's in the SERP plan, then yes, we absolutely need more storage and therefore more treatment, because to send further increments of water south, you need to have the requisite treatment in order to do that. And what we're seeing thus far is that we're kind of tenuous with existing runoff from the EAA as to meeting that water quality standard. We're improving, but we're still not there, and compliance testing begins next year on that. We also know that there's the LOSUM plan that allows us to send more lake water south. We haven't demonstrated a capacity to meet that sort of target. And then, of course, when the EA reservoir comes online, it will certainly have the capacity to deliver much more water south. So water quality, water treatment is not a perfect science. Even the modeling tools that we have available for that aren't perfect. Just like we were talking about the red tide model, these are things that need continual refinement and adapting. All that to say that, you know, we're going to have to continually revisit that water quality question, and it may ultimately lead to a conclusion that more treatment capacity is needed.
Yeah. Dan, I think some people are starting to arrive next door for your guys' next meeting you guys have. Did you want to wrap up with any thoughts, and maybe we can call this one?
Yeah, I mean, Steve, do you have anything you want to share? This is your opportunity.
Well, I just, you know, going back to some of your initial questions and our early discussion, that I spend too much time in the office, and now being an urban dweller, I don't get to utilize my kayak as much. So what we were talking about earlier just reminded me of how, you know, I need to do a better job of reconnecting with these ecosystems around us in South Florida and getting out on the water, and just it's really a special place. And the fact that we're now in October, we're seeing things cool down and dry down. I really look forward to getting out and you know, just reconnecting with this system that we're so lucky to have.
Yeah, no, I can't agree with you on. I'm in the same boat. I mean, I going from spending more of my awake time outdoors on the water than I did, you know, anywhere else on land or in buildings or anything like that. It's so important. And with my boys now, I mean, you put them, they're not even a year and a half apart. So you put them in a room together, and it's just a wrestling match, fighting, biting, punching, kicking, screaming. You take them outside, and it all stops. And it reminds me of, you know, being the you know, ADHD medicated kid throughout school. I don't have ADD when I'm outside. Everything makes sense. Everything feels comfortable. Everything feels calm. My thoughts are able to focus on everything around. But you put me in a building under, you know, artificial light, and you know, I'm like, my mind's racing, and I want to be out there. I want to be doing that. But it is so important, and we should definitely. I don't think we've ever even fished together. We should get out there and do that in Florida Bay and the Glades sometime. That would be cool.
It's crazy to think of that. How many times we've been on a boat together and we have not.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. No, we should definitely do that. That's. Yeah, it's hard to make time in the busy world, and you know, my boat's actually getting jazzed up a bit right now. It's getting rewired and new switch panel and stuff like that. So we'll be able to get out there and do that soon. It'll be fun.
Nice.
Look forward to that.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, we thank you so much for coming in, and hopefully we get to do this again, because your breadth of knowledge on Everglades restoration goes so much deeper than what we've just discussed. I think we scratched the surface. We got into a lot of great topics and kept it pretty high level, which is great for our audience, but the rabbit hole of Everglades restoration goes so deep, and we all know that you've been down each and every one of those. So hopefully we can do this again and dive in on some specific topics, and, you know, just keep this discussion going.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And if people want, you know, that we have the podcast at captainsforcleanwater.org email. We get a ton of feedback in there. Would love, you know, for those that are listening, we will have Dr. Stephen Davis on with us again for sure. If you have questions for him, please send them to that podcast email. We'll cover that in the next episode we do. And yeah, thank you for leading the charge in science. Science is badass. It's underappreciated. It's, you know, every time I go into the marine lab here at SCCF, which is another awesome partner that They worked on
great
that
group, yeah.
red tide study. Yeah, I mean, it's just that like you see some guy over there in the corner that's like all jazzed about something he sees in his microscope there, and it's just like, you know, I love it. Like, I have no idea what he's looking at, but like the passion's contagious, and you know, it's a incredible thing that you know, for you to see this all come full circle from, you know, first time on an airplane coming down to Florida and, you know, being immersed in the Everglades with you know, no cell phone and no GPS, to, you know, watching the world's largest wetland ecosystem restoration project unfold right in front of your eyes. That's awesome to share that experience with you, to have you share it with our audience. It's been a really cool ride, and we're glad to know you and glad to be partners with you and the Everglades Foundation. So thank you for your time,
Same.
Steve.
Thank you. Really appreciate this.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next time.